Private First Class James Holloway didn't see it coming. He couldn't have. In the chaos of the Ardennes forest on that freezing December morning in 1944, a man couldn't see 3 feet ahead through the fog and smoke that rolled through the trees like ghosts. The crack of rifles echoed from every direction, bouncing off the frozen earth and the skeletal branches above. The Germans were somewhere out there, hidden in the white landscape, and they were picking off American soldiers one by one with the precision of hunters who knew every inch of this cursed forest. Holloway was crouched behind what remained of a stone wall, his breath coming in sharp gasps that turned to vapor in the bitter cold. His hands, numb despite the worn gloves, gripped his M1 Garand so tightly his knuckles had gone pale beneath his brown skin. He was 22 years old, from Augusta, Georgia, and he had been in France for exactly 17 days. In those 17 days, he had learned that war was nothing like the training films they'd shown back at Camp Claiborne. He'd learned that cold could hurt worse than a wound. He'd learned that the taste of fear was metallic and constant, and he'd learned that in the eyes of many of the white soldiers fighting beside him, he was still just a colored boy who didn't belong here, no matter how many Germans he killed. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was supposed to be support. They were supposed to stay back, fire the big guns, and let the infantry do the dying. But when Hitler launched his desperate winter offensive through the Ardennes, when German tanks came screaming through the snow-covered hills in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, support units became frontline units. Artillery crews became infantrymen. And black soldiers who had been told they lacked the intelligence and courage for combat suddenly found themselves in the fight of their lives. The 333rd was one of only 2 African-American field artillery battalions in the European theater. And on December 16, 1944, they were directly in the path of the German advance. When other units retreated, the 333rd held the line at Wereth, Belgium. When ammunition ran low and the cold turned men's fingers black with frostbite, they kept firing. And when German paratroopers surrounded them in the forest, they fixed bayonets and fought like the soldiers they'd always been told they could never be. Holloway was with Baker Battery, separated from the main unit during a German counterattack that had turned the forest into a killing field. He was with 5 other men, 2 white sergeants from a reconnaissance unit, and 3 other black soldiers from his battery. They'd been pinned down for hours trying to make their way back to American lines, but the Germans had them boxed in. Every time they moved, bullets tore through the underbrush. Every time they tried to advance, mortar turned the ground into fountains of frozen earth and shrapnel. They were running out of ammunition. They were running out of time. And the temperature was dropping so fast that Holloway wondered if the cold might kill them before the Germans got the chance. One of the white sergeants, a man named Kowalski from Pittsburgh, had taken a piece of shrapnel in his leg. He was lying against a fallen log, his face gray with shock, his blood staining the snow beneath him. The other sergeant, a kid named Patterson, who couldn't have been more than 19, was trying to stop the bleeding with strips torn from his own undershirt. The 3 other black soldiers, Davis, Washington, and Monroe, were spread out in a defensive position, watching the tree line for movement. Nobody was talking. Nobody had the energy to talk. They all knew they were in trouble. They all knew that when darkness came, if they were still trapped here, the Germans would either capture them or finish them off. Holloway was watching the northern approach, his eyes scanning the gray-white landscape for any sign of movement, when he saw Patterson start to rise. The young sergeant was going to make a run for it, going to try to reach a better position where he might be able to see the German positions. It was a brave move. It was also suicide. Holloway saw it happening in slow motion. He saw Patterson gathering himself, saw him take a breath, saw him start to break cover. And in that instant, Holloway saw something else. A glint of metal in the branches of a tall pine about 100 yards out, a flash of movement, the distinctive outline of a carabiner 98K rifle with a scope, a German sniper, perfectly positioned, perfectly camouflaged, waiting for exactly this moment. The bullet was already in the air. The German had squeezed the trigger the second Patterson's head cleared the log. It was a perfect shot, the kind that snipers dream about, the kind that ends a life before the target even knows they're in danger. But Holloway moved. He didn't think. He didn't calculate the odds or consider the consequences. He just moved. He launched himself across the 6 feet of snow that separated him from Patterson, his body a blur of desperate motion. He hit the young sergeant with his shoulder, driving them both down behind the relative safety of a cluster of rocks. He felt the bullet pass overhead, heard it crack through the air where Patterson's head had been a fraction of a second before. He felt it slam into a tree behind them with a solid thunk that sent bark flying. They hit the ground hard, Holloway on top of Patterson, both of them gasping. For a moment there was silence. Then Patterson's voice, shaky and young, whispered, "Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ." He was aiming right at me. Holloway rolled off him, his heart hammering so hard he thought his ribs might crack. His hands were shaking. He'd just saved a man's life. He just put himself directly in the sights of a sniper who was very much still out there. He looked at Patterson, saw the fear in the kid's eyes, saw the way his hands were trembling as he realized how close he'd come to dying. And then Holloway saw something else in those eyes. Surprise. Not just surprise at being alive, but surprise that Holloway had saved him. Surprise that a black soldier had risked his life for a white sergeant. Washington, one of the other black soldiers, had seen the whole thing. He was a veteran, older than the rest of them, a man who'd grown up in Mississippi and knew exactly what it meant to be black in America. He'd enlisted because he believed, or wanted to believe, that serving his country might earn him and his people the respect they'd been denied. He'd survived North Africa and Sicily. He'd seen enough death to fill a lifetime. And now he was looking at Holloway with an expression that mixed pride with something darker, something sadder. Because Washington knew what Holloway was only beginning to understand. That heroism didn't change anything back home. That saving a white man's life in Belgium didn't make you any less of a second-class citizen in Georgia. That the army would still segregate their blood supplies, still assign black units to the worst positions, still deny them the recognition they earned with their blood. But in this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that there was still a German sniper in that tree, and he now knew exactly where they were. What mattered was that Kowalski was still bleeding and they were still trapped. What mattered was that night was coming, and if they didn't move soon, they'd all be dead or captured by morning. Holloway met Washington's eyes across the snow. There was a conversation there, silent but complete. They both knew what had to be done. Someone had to take out that sniper. And it wasn't going to be one of the white soldiers. Kowalski couldn't walk. Patterson was in shock, barely holding his rifle steady. It had to be one of the black soldiers from Baker Battery. It had to be them. Holloway started to move, but Washington held up a hand. The older man pointed to himself, then to Davis and Monroe. He was saying, "Let us do this. You've done enough." But Holloway shook his head. He'd seen where the sniper was. He'd watched the muzzle flash. He knew the position. And more than that, something had changed in him in the moment he'd thrown himself at Patterson. Something had broken through the fear and the cold and the constant awareness of his own expendability. For the first time since he'd put on this uniform, Holloway felt like a soldier. Not a black soldier. Not a colored support troop, just a soldier. And soldiers didn't let their brothers die when they could do something about it. The plan was simple, which meant it was probably stupid. Monroe would lay down suppressing fire from the left. Davis would move right, trying to draw the sniper's attention. Washington would wait, rifle ready for any opportunity, and Holloway would use the distraction to move forward, get closer, and take the shot that mattered. It wasn't much of a plan. The sniper had the advantage of position, cover, and probably experience. But it was what they had. It was all they had. Patterson tried to object, tried to say he should be the one going, but his voice was still shaking, and they all knew he'd never make it. Even Kowalski, through his pain, seemed to understand what was happening. He gripped Holloway's arm as the private moved past him, his fingers weak but insistent. "Make it count," the sergeant whispered. "Make it count, soldier." When Monroe opened up, the forest exploded with sound. His bar sent streams of tracers into the trees, cutting through branches, tearing bark from trunks, filling the air with the smell of cordite and pine sap. The German sniper didn't panic. He was too good for that. He shifted his position slightly, tracking Davis as the soldier made his move to the right. But that shift was what Holloway needed. He was already moving, low and fast, using every bit of cover the forest provided. He moved from tree to tree, rock to rock, his boots slipping on ice-covered roots, his breath burning in his lungs. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He could feel the weight of every step, the vulnerability of every moment he was exposed. Somewhere above, the sniper was searching for targets. Somewhere in those branches, death was waiting. Holloway reached a position about 60 yards from the sniper's tree. He could see the man now, or at least the outline of him, perched on a thick branch, wrapped in winter camouflage that made him nearly invisible against the gray bark and white snow. The German was scanning left, where Davis had drawn his attention. He hadn't seen Holloway yet. Might never see him. This was the moment. This was what all the training had been for. All the hours on the range at Camp Claiborne. All the times the instructors had told him and his fellow black soldiers that they'd never measure up, that they didn't have what it took. This was the moment that proved them wrong or proved them right. Holloway settled behind a fallen log, braced his rifle, and found the sniper in his sights. The German was young. Holloway could see that now, through the crude iron sights of his Garand, probably not much older than Patterson, probably from some small village in Bavaria or Prussia, probably told by his officers that he was fighting for his homeland, for his people, for his Führer, probably never questioning what that meant, what horrors his nation had unleashed on the world. But in this moment, none of that mattered either. In this moment, he was just a man with a rifle who was trying to kill Holloway's brothers in arms. And Holloway had to stop him. The shot was difficult. The angle was poor. The wind was gusting, pushing snow horizontally through the trees. But Holloway had been shooting since he was 8 years old, hunting rabbits and quail in the fields around Augusta. He knew how to read wind. He knew how to steady his breath. He knew how to trust the rifle and let the shot surprise him. He squeezed the trigger. The Garand kicked against his shoulder. The shot cracked through the forest, distinct and final, and in the branches of the pine tree the German sniper jerked once. His rifle falling from his hands, his body pitching forward and tumbling through the branches before hitting the snow below with a soft thump that seemed impossibly quiet after all the noise. For a moment everything was still. Then Monroe stopped firing. Davis stopped moving. Washington lowered his rifle. They'd done it. They'd taken out the sniper. They'd eliminated the immediate threat. And Holloway, his hands still shaking from adrenaline, realized he was still alive. They were all still alive. Getting back to American lines took another 4 hours. They fashioned a crude stretcher for Kowalski using branches in their field jackets. They moved slowly, carefully, expecting at any moment to run into another German position, but the forest seemed to have emptied. The Germans were pulling back, regrouping, preparing for their next push. By the time Baker Battery's survivors reached friendly positions, night had fallen completely, and the temperature had dropped to near zero. Medics rushed to take Kowalski, who had drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey. An officer debriefed them quickly, took their report, and sent them to get warm food and rest. Patterson tried to tell the officer what Holloway had done, tried to explain how the private had saved his life and taken out the sniper. But the officer was distracted, overwhelmed with casualty reports and tactical updates. He nodded vaguely and moved on to the next crisis. In the days that followed, as the Battle of the Bulge raged across Belgium and Luxembourg, Holloway's actions became just another footnote in a battle full of desperate heroism. Patterson put him in for a Bronze Star, wrote up a detailed account of what had happened in that forest. But the paperwork got lost or misplaced or simply ignored in the chaos of the fighting. Washington wasn't surprised. He'd seen it before. Seen black soldiers perform acts of incredible courage only to be passed over for medals that white soldiers received for less. He'd seen black units bear the brunt of German attacks and then be left out of the official histories. He'd seen the blood of black men stain the same ground as white men, only to have that sacrifice forgotten or diminished. That was the reality of serving as a black soldier in 1944. You could be a hero in the moment. You could save lives, take enemy positions, hold the line when others broke. But when the medals were handed out, when the stories were told, when the photographs were taken for the newspapers back home, you were often nowhere to be found. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion would pay an even higher price in the days to come. On December 17th, the day after Holloway's encounter with the sniper, a patrol from the battalion was captured by German SS troops near Wereth, Belgium. 11 black soldiers, already wounded, already exhausted, were taken prisoner. And instead of being treated as prisoners of war, protected under the Geneva Conventions that were supposed to govern civilized warfare, they were tortured and murdered. Their bodies were found weeks later, frozen in the snow, bearing evidence of brutal beatings, stabbings, and systematic execution. The Wereth 11, as they would eventually be called, became one of the forgotten atrocities of World War II, a war crime that went largely unprosecuted and unacknowledged for decades. Holloway learned about Wereth 2 days after it happened. He was in a bombed-out barn that served as temporary quarters for what remained of Baker Battery, trying to write a letter home to his mother in Augusta, trying to find words to describe what he'd seen and done without frightening her. When Washington told him about the 11 men, about what the Germans had done to them, Holloway stopped writing. He put down his pencil. He stared at the rough stone wall of the barn and felt something harden inside him. These were his brothers. These were men who'd trained with him, eaten with him, shared cigarettes and stories and fears. These were men who'd volunteered to fight for a country that treated them as inferiors, who'd put on the uniform despite knowing they'd face discrimination from their own officers, who'd believe that their service might somehow matter, might somehow change things. And they'd died badly, died in pain, died knowing that the enemy saw them as less than human, just as many Americans back home saw them as less than human. But Holloway didn't break. None of them broke. Baker Battery stayed in the line. They fired their guns until the barrels glowed red. They held their positions when German tanks rolled through the morning fog. They fought through Bastogne, through the brutal cold of January, through the slow, grinding push that eventually broke the German offensive and sent the Wehrmacht reeling back toward the Rhine. They fought because that's what soldiers do. They fought because their brothers beside them needed them. They fought because, despite everything, despite the injustice and the indignity, and the constant reminder that they were second-class citizens, they were still Americans. They were still men. They were still determined to prove that courage and honor had no color. Patterson never forgot what Holloway did in that forest. When the war ended and they all went home, Patterson to Pennsylvania and Holloway to Georgia, they wrote letters for a few years. Patterson married his high school sweetheart and opened a hardware store. Holloway went back to work in a textile mill and tried to adjust to civilian life in a South that hadn't changed. A South where his uniform and his service meant nothing to the white men who still expected him to step off the sidewalk when they passed, to enter through the back door, to accept without question his place in the social order. Patterson kept trying to get Holloway recognized for his bravery. He wrote letters to the army, to his congressman, to anyone who might listen. But the letters went unanswered or received polite replies that explained the procedures and requirements for medals, the need for documentation and witnesses and official reports that had long since been lost or destroyed. The years passed. Holloway married a schoolteacher named Dorothy and raised 3 children. He rarely talked about the war. When his sons asked him about it, about what he'd done in Europe, he would deflect, change the subject, tell them it was a long time ago and didn't matter anymore. But Dorothy knew it mattered. She saw the way he woke sometimes in the night, gasping, his hands reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. She saw the way his face changed when news came of another death, another veteran passing away, another brother from the 333rd taking his stories with him to the grave. She saw the way he watched the Memorial Day parade, standing to the side, never marching, never wearing his uniform, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to claim that pride. Washington lasted until 1968. He died of a heart attack in Jackson, Mississippi, just weeks after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. Davis made it to 1971. Monroe survived until 1983, long enough to see the memorial finally erected at Wereth, Belgium, honoring the 11 black soldiers who'd been murdered there in 1944. Patterson died in 1995, still frustrated that he'd never been able to get Holloway the recognition he deserved. And Holloway himself lived until 2003, dying quietly at the age of 81 in a nursing home in Augusta. Surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved him but never fully understood what he'd survived, what he'd done, what he'd sacrificed. There was no Bronze Star, no newspaper stories, no official recognition of the day in December 1944 when a 22-year-old black private from Georgia saved a white sergeant's life and took out a German sniper in the frozen forests of Belgium. The records had been lost. The witnesses had died. The moment had been swallowed by the vastness of the war, by the millions of individual acts of courage and terror and survival that made up that global catastrophe. But the moment it happened, it had been real, and it mattered. It mattered because in that instant, when the bullet was already in the air, James Holloway proved something that should never have needed proving. He proved that heroism has no color. He proved that courage isn't determined by the shade of a man's skin or the prejudices of his society. He proved that when the moment demands it, when lives hang in the balance, a soldier is a soldier, nothing more, nothing less. The 333rd Field Artillery Battalion fought through the entire Battle of the Bulge and continued fighting until VE Day in May. 1,945. They took casualties that would have broken lesser units. They endured cold that killed men in their sleep. They faced an enemy that saw them as subhuman, and they won. Not because the army believed in them, not because their country honored them, but because they believed in each other, because they refused to quit, because they carried within them a pride and dignity that no amount of discrimination could destroy. When they came home, most returned to the same segregation, the same discrimination, the same denial of their full humanity that they'd left behind. But they also returned with something else, with the knowledge that they'd faced the worst the world could throw at them and survived, with the certainty that they were as good as any soldiers who'd ever fought, with the hope, perhaps futile but unshakable, that someday the country they'd defended would finally recognize them as the men and heroes they'd always been. Today, if you visit the American Military Cemetery at Henry-Sapel in Belgium, you can find the graves of soldiers from the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. The white marble crosses stand in perfect rows, identical and eternal. The names carved into those crosses are black and white, Protestant and Catholic and Jewish, Southern and Northern, rich and poor. Death made them equal in a way life never did. The forest where Holloway saved Patterson's life is still there, though the trees have grown taller and the scars of battle have healed. The pine where the German sniper made his last stand has probably fallen by now, rotted and returned to the earth. The snow that soaked up their fear and their courage melts every spring and returns every winter, indifferent to the history it once witnessed. But somewhere in that forest, in the memory of that place, something remains. A moment of pure humanity cutting through the fog of war and prejudice. A moment when a black soldier looked at a white soldier and saw not the uniform or the rank or the race, but simply a brother in danger. A moment when instinct and training and something deeper, something fundamental to who James Holloway was, drove him to risk everything for someone who society had taught him to see as superior, as other, as separate. That moment multiplied by thousands across every battlefield of the war, by every black soldier who fought and bled and died for a country that wouldn't let them drink from the same water fountains, is the true story of the African-American experience in World War II. Not a story of bitterness, though they had every right to be bitter. Not a story of hesitation, though they had every reason to hesitate. But a story of extraordinary courage in the face of not one enemy but two, of fighting fascism abroad while facing racism at home, of proving over and over and over again a truth that should have been self-evident from the beginning. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the price of freedom and the cost of prejudice, if it reminded you that history is made of individual moments of courage by ordinary people who became extraordinary when the moment demanded it, then please take a second to like this video. It truly helps us keep these untold stories alive, these voices that were silenced or ignored for too long, these acts of heroism that deserve to be remembered. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us about the veterans in your own family, the stories that need to be told, the moments that shaped your understanding of courage and sacrifice. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover more real stories of black heroes whose courage changed the course of history, whose blood watered the tree of liberty, whose sacrifice demands that we do better, that we be better, that we finally live up to the ideals they fought to defend. Because their stories matter, their lives mattered, and as long as we remember them, as long as we tell their truths, they continue to fight for a better world, a more just world, a world worthy of their sacrifice.